here we go. Well, my name is Jim Pingle, if you didn't recognize my voice. Welcome to our March 2015 Hangout. We are going to be covering bandwidth monitoring this month. I'm going to do sort of like I've been doing the last couple of months, more of a demo, not just talking about it. So I've got a bunch of the different bandwidth monitoring packages installed on a VM, which we don't really recommend the gigantic belt and suspenders approach, but just for a quick demo, it's a good thing to do. Just a little, before we get started, I've got a couple of project notes. Our 2.2.1 release is out, and it's mostly security and bug fixes. We've got some things in there that are good to have. It's all in all better shape than 2.2 was. So if you were on 2.2, definitely move to 2.2.1. If you were on 2.1, look at the upgrade guide and all the other notes and things, and you might find that moving up to 2.2.1 is better than moving to 2.2, depending on features you're using and what things you might encounter. Our pfSense University online training, we've got more and more classes we're adding, so just if you haven't been able to get in one, just keep an eye on the schedule. We're adding more all the time, and they fill up pretty quick. We have our new ADI hardware that I talked about last month. Boards and things are in. We're doing some testing. They should be shipping very soon. And as I just mentioned, we're looking to change our Hangout hosting software next month. We've got a couple ideas, but we haven't settled on anything yet. So it's definitely moving away from Fuse. We just don't know if it'll be what we're moving to quite yet. So in this Hangout, we're going to be covering all sorts of built-in and add-on package methods for performing bandwidth monitoring. Some are more detailed than others, and obviously everybody's going to have different requirements. So whatever you need, is going to have a different set of packages or solutions that might fit it. We're going to be covering different ways of getting per IP data and aggregate monitoring, like per interface type monitoring. Including the built-in RRD graphs, SNMP, traffic graphs that are built in, pfTop, bandwidth D, Darkstat, IfTop, nTopng, vnStat 2, and a little bit of Softflowd and NetFlow. I won't be talking about proxy solutions, things like LightSquid or Sarge, just because they only cover HTTP, they don't cover all traffic, and we're trying to cover things that will do all of your traffic this month. A couple general notes about how some of these things operate. Some of these packages only let you monitor a single interface, which sort of limits their utility in some cases. If you only have a WAN and a LAN, it's not a big killer because you can just monitor the LAN. That way you get your local addresses for tracking down who's using what. If you have a fully routed setup, you could just monitor the WAN side of things because you'll get all. If you have routed addresses on the inside, then you'll see them all the way through. You don't have to worry quite so much. Whereas with the traditional setup that you find in sort of like a Soho type environment or in a lot of environments where you only have a limited number of external addresses, there's NAT involved. So if you want to track down a local user, you need to look on the inside. Where that sort of falls apart is when you have multiple LANs, like a LAN, a DMZ, a management interface, things like that. If you want to monitor bandwidth, you may have to opt for a package that's capable of tracking multiple interfaces. And there are some limitations of things like bandwidth D and Softflowd, where they will only report if the traffic is over a certain threshold. It varies a little bit from package to package in circumstances, so you just need to be aware of that. If it's a relatively quiet interface, you might not see much, if anything, reported by bandwidth D or Softflowd, but if you pump some traffic through it, it'll start graphing or sending out exports. Here's a feature matrix of our various options, and we'll be covering just about all of these things. I'll mention them here briefly, and then we'll go into more detail on each of these options as I show them to you. First, in the first column is just the name of the package. The second column is whether or not it can handle multiple interfaces. The third column is whether or not it gives you per IP data, and so if it's a no there, it just means it's aggregate data only. It's sort of like per interface, or in some cases there's a star there. That means it gives you even more detail. It gives you like per port or per flow, per connection type information, not just per IP. Whether or not it has graphs, whether it's built in or not. Notice I did the built-in stuff first, then after that it's all packages. whether or not it's it's got a web interface or a GUI. Then there's whether it's friendly with nanoBSD, and then whether or not it gives you any real-time information, because some of these do have a real-time component. First off, you get the RRD graphs. It does handle multiple interfaces, but it doesn't give you per IP info. It's just per interface. It does have graphs, obviously. It's built in. It's part of the GUI. It will work just fine on nanoBSD. You've got a little asterisk there because it's one of these situations where it's handled a little bit differently on nanoBSD in order to be able to save the data. But I'll mention that when I talk more in detail about it. And it's not real time, it's just historical data. Now, SNMP, it's a little bit different. It's not really a means to get the data looking on the firewall. You'd have to be pulling from some sort of external agent or external monitoring system. It can do multiple interfaces, but it's not per IP. It's sort of like RD graphs. It just gives you aggregate interface data. The graphing, that's up to whatever is pulling the SNMP data. SNMP daemon is built in. There is a GUI to configure that, but obviously not a GUI to see graphs and things like that on pfSense. Works just fine on nanoBSD, but real time, that's really up to whatever's pulling. You got our widgets and traffic graphs that are built in, which are the SVG graphs. You can get multiple interfaces on the dashboard widget at the same time, or on the other graph one at a time. Does on the actual page, there's a table with some per IP info, but it's not graphed. It does produce graphs, obviously. It is built in. It's in the GUI. Works fine on nanoBSD, and that is real time. We got pfTop, which is really interesting. It will handle multiple interfaces because it reads off the state table. Gives you per state information, so it's really like per connection or per flow. Doesn't do graphs, but it is built in. It's in the GUI and in the console, and it works fine on nanoBSD, and that is real-time information. Bandwidth D, just a single interface. A lot of people like bandwidth D, but it is kind of limited. It does per IP graphs, which is nice, which is why most people like it. Obviously does graphs. It's an add-on package. Works in the GUI. NanoBSD is kind of iffy on there. I'll go into a little bit more detail of that in a minute. Real time. It's not real time. It's only historical data. Darkstat, a little bit lighter. It does multiple interfaces. It is per IP, at least in a table format. It does interface graphs only. It doesn't do a per IP graph. It is a package in the GUI. Works fine on nanoBSD, though you might have. I don't think it keeps data across reboots. And it does both real time and at least for total bandwidth, it does real time. But for everything else, it's more historical. IfTop is console only. It only does a single interface at a time. You can do multiple interfaces, but it's not really something it doesn't really apply to that. Gives you per state information, no graphs really, some simple bar graphs while you're running it. It's not built in, no GUI, nanoBSD, and it works fine on nanoBSD, and it is fully real time. nTopng, multiple interfaces, per IP information, does graphs just fine. It's not built in, obviously. Does have a nice pretty GUI. nanoBSD, no, that's a no-go, definitely not. It's too big. It wants to write data in various places. It's just not suited for that at all. But it does historical and real-time information, which is really handy. vnStat 2, some people like it a little bit simpler than others. It does more summary information. Does multiple interfaces just fine, but it doesn't give you any per IP info. It's just summary graphs and tables. It does have some graphs on some time-based areas. Not built in, is in the GUI, but works fine on nanoBSD, but it's not real time. And then Softflowd is sort of like the opposite of SNMP, whereas some external agent pulls SNMP data, but Softflowd is pushing it out to a NetFlow collector. It does do multiple interfaces just fine. It does per flow or per state data. No graphs. It's not built in, but there is a GUI to configure it. Works fine on nanoBSD, and the real time is really up to whatever is receiving the flow data. I don't know if there's any. There might be a commercial solution out there that's got more like a real time flow display type thing, but that's not applicable to our package anyway. All right, so for starters, let's go and log back in here. we're going to check out the RRD graphs, which are built in. They are always on unless you turn them off. They're on by default. They're there for everybody. They're historical per interface total traffic, per interface packets per second graphs. So like over here on the system tab, up here there's throughput, which is total aggregate throughput of the entire system. And then over here on the traffic and the packets graph, you have your various interfaces that you can pick, and each one here has the averaged out graphs. The further back you go, the more they're averaged out, so peaks get smoothed out. It's not very accurate once after a certain point. So if you had a very brief spike in bandwidth, it might show up. See, here's a pretty significant spike. On the 1 day graph, it does show up pretty good, and then on the 1 week graph, yeah, kinda, but as you go, it sort of thins out, and you can barely see it on the more average graphs. So the further back you go in time, you're only going to see sustained transfers. These traffic graphs are in megabits per second, or bits per second rather, including the data tables down below. And your packets per second over here, this is more just the rate at which the data is flowing through the network interfaces. Because you could have the hardware being overloaded by lots of really tiny packets, because passing, say, 10 megabits per second at 1500 byte packets is a lot less work for a NIC than passing 10 megabits per second at 64 byte packets. A lot more packets involved. Sometimes you might see a system that's heavily loaded. You don't really see much on the traffic graph, but you come over here to the packets graph and it's through the roof, and then it kind of gives you an idea what to do. Now these stats in the RRD graphs are generated by PF counters, so if you have the firewall disabled, that's not going to work for you. You really will you would need to have PF on for that to give you anything meaningful. Now on NanoBSD, the graphs are kept in the RAM disk, but they are saved during shutdown. A clean shutdown anyway, or a clean reboot. But if the power gets pulled, then you'll lose some data. But if you go here to System Advanced on the Miscellaneous tab, down here at the bottom, you can set up a periodic RRD backup if you're using NanoBSD, or if you've got the RAM disk option enabled for a full install. You can set it to be a backup every couple hours, anywhere between every 1 and 24 hours. So for people who've got that option set, that's good if you really want to retain that RRD data and protect it from data loss. And the RRD data also, you can back it up if you go to Backup or Store. It's not backed up by default, but if you uncheck this box, then all the graph data will be encoded, and actually it's compressed and then encoded, put into the config XML when you download a backup. That way, if you restore it, you would also restore all your graph data. So it's a pretty good option. It's all built in, all automatic, but it doesn't give you a lot of detail that most people want to see. Now for SNMP, it's just here under the Services menu, and SNMP, you can just check the box to enable it, set your read community string. Obviously you do not want to leave that at public. You want to set it to something a bit longer. Eventually, hopefully, we'll have a better SNMP daemon that will do better authentication. But for the moment, you can just use this. It uses version 2C of SNMP. Most of these modules, you might want to leave them enabled, especially MIB2 for the NetGraph and PF and everything. Just make sure you get all your data. But you would have some external system pulling this, like Cacti or Zabbix, or just basically any network management system usually has a way to pull SNMP and graph data. But that's outside the scope of what we're going to look at here today. But that is, it does give you per interface data, it doesn't give you per IP data. So similar to RRD graphs, it doesn't, it may not give you a lot of detail, but you can centralize the logging. Like say you've got a dozen firewalls, you could have SNMP track your graphs all in one central location for a dozen different firewalls, rather than having to log into them all individually and pull them out that way. And there are some SNMP programs you can get that will pull the agent just like once per second, sort of give you a sort of a real-time-ish graph That varies from program to program, but if you look around, you can find some that'll do that. Now we've got our traffic graphs here that are built in. We've got they're here on this widget, and they're also here under status and traffic graph. Now if we look at the LAN side here, I just need to go to a VM here and trigger just a little bit of bandwidth just to show you what it's going to do. You can see as I loaded a web page, the host briefly popped up in this table, and you can see it showed up as a little bit of a blip on the real-time graph. These options up here, the sort by, filter, and display, control what shows up in this table. The interface controls which interface is there. You can sort of change the scaling and values of the graph, but for most people the defaults are just fine. It does require an SVG compatible browser, which everything modern is, including the most recent versions of Internet Explorer, but if it doesn't work for you, try another browser. I know in particular we have had reports that these graphs do not work with Firefox and the FlashBlock extension, even with Flash Allowed. Not exactly sure why, but it still seems to block those. It doesn't give a way around it. So if it doesn't work for you in Firefox, try a different browser or try disabling the FlashBlock extension. To get any kind of historical context out of this, you do need to leave the browser open. So it will graph over time, but you'll get I forget exactly what the length of this is, if it's 10 minutes or 15 or maybe 20 minutes worth of time, and then it will scroll as it reaches that time. And back here on the dashboard, you can get that same data for multiple interfaces at a time. You can expand or collapse these additional graphs. If you want to save the state of which graphs are expanded, you can click this little wrench here and click save after you've got it set like you want. You can also up the refresh interval a little bit. By default it's every 10 seconds, but you can go a little bit faster if you want. Don't recommend going too fast, but just a lot of browsers would have issues with the JavaScript firing that fast sometimes. Alright, moving right along, we've got pfTop, which you can run from the GUI or from the shell. It's here under Diagnostics and pfTop. As you can see, this is it's got data going per state, so it's got the source IP import, destination IP import, and several different options here. You have a whole bunch of different views, including some that are really interesting. Like if you go to the label view, it shows you based on your firewall rules which rules are getting hit, which maybe not be interesting from a traffic point of view, but it is very interesting from traffic or from a rule management type view. And there are views here for size and speed and state and time. They're sort of optimized for viewing things in those ways. Like if we go to size, it'll show what things have had the most data transferred, and you can sort these also by other like age, destination bytes, and everything else. You can get that from the GUI or you can get that from the shell. Here on the shell, if you look, it's option 9 for pfTop, or if you drop to a shell prompt and type just pfTop, you'll run into it there as well. If you type question mark while you're in it at the console, you can see the different sorting shortcuts, and then you can switch between the different displays there using so it's a lot more useful at the console because you can actually go through and do filtering and sorting and other things there. And obviously, since that pulls information from the pf state table, you do have to have pf enabled for that to work. Alright, if we look at bandwidth D here, it is a package. That's the first one I'm going to talk about. So you just install it in the usual way. Go to System and Packages. Go over here to the Available Packages tab, find it in the list, and click plus, and then follow through the confirmation prompts. After it's installed, it goes up here. You go up here to Services and Bandwidth D to configure it. For the most simple configuration, all you have to do is check Enable, pick your interface, and then come down here to the bottom and make sure that Draw Graphs is checked, and then save it. And sometimes with packages like this, you might end up having to save it once or twice before the service will kick in, but just usually just pick those and save. I also like to set promiscuous mode, but that's more of a personal preference these days. It doesn't have to be enabled, but you have it. If you have it enabled, it'll catch a little bit more traffic that's not quite a little bit. It's traffic that's not may not be destined for this, but it still arrives at the NIC. Where you see most difference with that is if it's running in a virtual machine environment and it has promiscuous mode on. It might see other things in the segment, sort of like an old hub style thing. I also like to check output and recover CDF, so it actually outputs the data to log files, and then it recovers that data on startup. That way you have historical information between executions of bandwidth D. Word of warning with this, and some of the other ones too, it does not hook into our privilege system. So if you go over to access bandwidth D and you look at the tab here, this is running at your firewall's URL /bandwidth D. Anybody who can reach the GUI port can load that URL without authentication. If you run a package like this, you need to be sure that you do not have that port open to the world, and that you do not have that port open to people on your local network that you don't want to see that. Scrolling down here, you can see it's got daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, top 20 report up here at the top, and then your subnets that it has seen. Here's this is a total graph for everything, and then it goes into per IP graphs. And if you have DNS set up and everything right, these will also show the host names there. I don't have DNS set up just on this test VM, so it's not showing anything here. You can see there's a sent graph and a receive graph, and I've been downloading some stuff here in this VM, so you can see that I've got some traffic moving through it. And if you have a lot more hosts on your network, it'll look a lot more interesting. And then at the end, it shows that has the firewall itself. You'll see traffic always sending out from the firewall, being received on others. And it gives you a protocol breakdown of what it sees. And most of the stuff I've been messing with has been HTTP. Other protocols, it'll put in a different color on the graph as well, sort of a stack there. All right, so let's see. We showed how to configure it. This is all historical information. Gives you per IP graphs and a total aggregate graph. Some people have had issues with this package, either causing issues where it's caused a problem with the GUI or with booting, or installing or uninstalling has caused other issues. It's nothing we've ever been able to reproduce in-house, but it's just something to be aware of, that people have had issues with the package. And if you can ever figure out a way to reproduce a particular problem with that package, feel free to post on the forum or let us know. If we can reproduce it, we can find a way to get the package fixed. But some people have had issues with it. We really prefer this to be run on a full install. It will install on NanoBSD, and it's in better shape for NanoBSD now than it has been in the past. But I would still avoid it on NanoBSD. That's pretty much it for bandwidth D. It's not too complicated to get going. The number one thing you might see is if it just comes up, if you come over here and it just says there's nothing to graph, usually that means that there hasn't been enough bandwidth that has moved through that to go above that threshold I mentioned earlier. So it's either hasn't seen enough data to graph. There could be some other issues with the package in general. You might need to check the forum, but 9 times out of 10, if it hasn't drawn a graph, it's just because it hasn't seen enough data to graph. And that could mean you've got it looking on the wrong interface, or you just don't have it listening on an interface where there's a lot of traffic. All right, well, next up we've got Darkstat, which shows up here under Diagnostics and Darkstat Settings. One of these packages is not making my VM too happy at the moment, so it keeps logging me out. Alright, so that's under Diagnostics and Darkstat Settings. Pretty simple. All you can do is pick interfaces for it to run on. I've got it set to run on LAN and WAN. This is another one you might have to click save 2 times before the daemon actually kicks in. It does run its own daemon on a completely separate port. It runs on port 666, and again, sort of like bandwidth D, if somebody can hit that port they will be able to load this data. There's no authentication. This is a very fast and light setup. It doesn't necessarily do data persistently, like over time, but it will give you some really good information here, at least for while it's running. You can see I downloaded a few things quite a bit before the Hangout started, and a couple things after. If you press this automatic reload button here, then the last 60 seconds graph turns into a real-time graph. And if I kick my browser over here in that VM, you'll see it showed a spike. So and this does reload once per second, so a little bit faster than our built-in traffic graph. So, but it doesn't give you any per IP data here. If you go over here to the host tab, it does give you per IP info, like a summary. You can see, you can sort these columns and figure out, okay, who's had the most data sending out, who's had it, most data coming in toward them, things like that. Total data transferred, when the last time they were on the network. So if you're looking for a bandwidth hog over time, this is a good way to find them. And also it shows you the external addresses too. Like you can see here, this cachefly address, I downloaded a 100 meg test file from them a couple times, and you can see here it shows that it's transferred that much data through me. And then if you click on one of these hosts here, let's go with this guy. It gives you actually shows you the MAC address, when it was last seen, and then it gives you a breakdown of protocol information, which port they were hitting, with TCP, with UDP, and other IP protocols total. So it's pretty useful information. This one is probably more useful on smaller platforms like NanoBSD that don't have a lot of RAM or space in general to hold this stuff. So it's a pretty nice little deal, but you do need to be wary of the daemon that it runs and make sure that only your approved management workstations can reach the firewall on port 666. And it does support IPv4 and IPv6. You can see some multicast here. I don't have IPv6 set up on that interface of that VM necessarily for a really good demonstration, but it's pretty handy. Next up, one of my favorites is IfTop. It has no GUI component. It is a package, but it has no GUI component. It's very easy to use from the shell, and this is the way I normally run it, with this lowercase n, uppercase n, lowercase p, and I. What that translates to is the lowercase n is so it does not do hostname lookups. Otherwise it'll do DNS on every IP it sees. The uppercase n doesn't resolve the port numbers to service names because it's not always accurate for how they're really used. But if you leave off that capital N, like if it sees port 80, it would show HTTP instead. The lowercase p runs in promiscuous mode, so it sees more traffic. The uppercase p turns on the display of ports, otherwise it just does per IP traffic. So if I run this, iftop-nnppi, I is for your interface, do em1, which is my LAN, and it'll show us some information here. Let me reload this web page here. Actually, let me start a long download and we'll see what it's doing. It has several different views. You can see here first it starts off 2 lines per host, so it has 1 line for sent, 1 line for received. If you press T once, it turns that into a 1 line per host, which does back and forth in 1 line. It kind of draws a bar graph behind the hosts, so they are sorted based on throughput, so the heavy users are going to bubble to the top of this list. But it is real time and it updates constantly, so if something is only occasionally doing data, you may not spot it here, but if somebody is, say, running a very large download or heavy streaming, things like that, you'll definitely catch them here. And just if we do this again without the port displays, you can see here it's just per host rather than per connection. So if you're really just interested in who is using the bandwidth rather than what service it is, you can just run the port display and it'll show you IP pairings. It still just does one user in or the IPs on both sides, so it doesn't necessarily help you figure out if just one user is connecting to 1,000 others. There could be some interesting things there. You can see here in the help, it's got various other ways you can sort. You can sort by source or destination or by various columns. You can pause the display and scroll through the longer, like if you have a bunch of hosts, you can scroll through the display. And yeah, it's pretty useful for tracking down abusers in real time. And it's very small, very light. It doesn't hurt. It's one of them that whenever I'm on a firewall that I manage, it's one that I put on there all the time, just because it's small. It's nice to have. All right, now here's the crown jewel of monitoring, the 800-pound gorilla, nTopng. It is by far the best looking of all the options. It is a package. It's very large and heavy. It chews up a bit of RAM, a bit of CPU to do all of its monitoring. First thing you'd want to do, let's go back here, log back in. You go over here to the diagnostics menu and go to nTopng settings first. On here, at a minimum, you need to put in a password and confirm password, because this, like Darkstat, it runs its own daemon on its own port, but this one does have authentication, so it's not quite as bad. Still not something you'd want to leave open to the world, but it's not quite so imperative to block it locally. The port for this is 3000, so by default it runs on port 3000 for the daemon. But if you put in the password here doesn't have to match your admin password or anything for the firewall itself, so it just has to match obviously the confirm password, and that's it. So you put in the password, you pick the interface, and then really that's all you have to do. You can pick how it handles DNS and how it handles your local networks. The defaults here are pretty sane, so you don't really have to worry about those too much. Historical data storage, if you don't have that checked, it won't retain data between runs of nTopng, so something restarts it. It won't have the older data. If you disable alerts is a good one to check too, because oftentimes if there's a very busy host, it might get flagged as a flutter, and it's not something that you really need to care about a whole lot. But it's really a matter of preference there. All right, and if we come over here to nTopng, this is what it looks like. It gives you a flow talker graph here, and if I just refresh something over here in this other one, it'll show you how right now it's doing a big transfer that I still have running between these hosts, but once I have it talking to something else, it shows that this host is making a connection out to another device. And this is all just here on the dashboard. It shows you the active hosts. This is all current real-time information here on the dashboard. The number of hosts, so if you have a very busy host, it'll show up here as well. It's also very good for finding abusers. Here on ports, it shows the common ports. So say you've got a spam bot or something on your network, you'd probably see a lot of traffic going out to like 25 or things like that. Applications shows you HTTP, or tries to decode a little bit about beyond the port what it's doing. And then senders and ASN, those might be more useful when you have a lot more hosts or your own public networks and things. Beyond that, you can also go up here and look at flows, which are the active data flows or connections that are going through. It shows you what its actual throughput, total bytes, the things that are actually going right now. Over here on hosts, if you go to the host list, this is everything that it has seen recently, and you can get some other information out of these here. There's a top host by traffic, there's GeoIP if you've got GeoIP, tree map and local matrix. Those aren't very good here because I've only got a couple IPs that show up, but if you have a larger number of users, these become a lot more useful. So like over here, the top host for traffic, it's going to end up having your more useful, the bandwidth hogs are going to sort of be up toward the top of the list there. Mostly just here on the host list and interactions, you can kind of get an idea of who's talking to who. It centers the graph around the firewall at first, and then maybe who's the most active. If you come over here back to the host list and you find your host that you're interested in, if you click on that host, it shows you a little bit of information about that host and how it's used data historically. It shows you as much information as it was able to decode. It found out that that VM was Linux, which is good. It's not 100% accurate on this. We've seen it flag some Windows hosts as Linux and some Linux as Windows. Depends on what you're running. But it does its best to try to guess. If it had resolved by DNS, it would show you the reverse name here, or you can rename it with your own custom name if you don't have it in DNS. First and last seen, sent and received, breakdown, how many flows it's had as a client or a server. So if you have something you know as a client but it's got a bunch of server flows, you might be worried about what it's doing. You can download this JSON data if you want to parse it some other way. And here on this activity map, it gives you an idea historically about when that device has been in use. It's based on how many flows happened during different time periods of the day. So if it's gray, it was idle, and then the darker it is, the more active they were during those time periods. And if you hover, it shows you, exactly when those were seen. So it has both real-time and historical data, per IP graphs, protocol data, more information than most people would ever probably need, and by far is the best looking and most polished of all of them. So you got, in addition to just that regular host data, you can also even get down to a packet level, sent received distribution, port breakdown on a per host data, what peers they're talking to and how much traffic they sent to them. So if you've got enough RAM and space on the box to run this is by far the best one to use. And don't get it confused with the old nTop one. It says nTop up here, but this is the nTopng package. The older nTop package is probably going to be disappearing any moment now because they discontinued that upstream in favor of nTopng. So this is sort of its successor, and now that this is working and it's stable, the old one is just going to disappear eventually. There's not much it does. I don't think there's anything it does better than this. So yeah, by far, if you can get away with it, this is definitely the one to use. All right, next down the line we've got vnStat 2, which is another package. You get to that. Let me make sure, as predicted. Status and vnStat 2. Not a whole lot you really need to configure for it. Just check that box to enable the front end and press save. Again, probably a good idea to press save twice on that just to be on the safe side. Come over here to vnStat ITab and you can pick your interface and save it there. And then you can access the front end, and it shows you a nice summary here of your total information and information from the last 10 days. Over here in this first column you see the different interfaces, WAN, LAN, and the ops interfaces that I've got. You can get a summary per interface, or it gives you hourly data, hourly graphs, and shows you different time periods when data was used. Same for days and months. So it's a pretty good historical. This is a good complement to the RRD graphs, but gives you essentially this similar, very similar information to the RRD graphs. You can also, rather than looking at the front end, come over here to the vnStat info tab, pick an interface and save, and you can get output from these various views here and sort of get a similar view to the graphical view, but just in a text layout format. So it's useful, but it has limited information. So some people really like it, but if it gives you the information you need, then more power to you. And again, this one also doesn't hook into the privilege system for most of this, so we need to be wary of people who have access to the GUI and what they can load. Softflowd is a little bit different animal entirely. It is, as I mentioned earlier, a NetFlow exporter. So it's a daemon that sits here on your firewall, and it watches for traffic and records information about traffic flows, like who connected to whom and where they went, or what IPs were involved, what port numbers were involved, how much data was transferred, that kind of stuff. And periodically it will send that flow data off to a NetFlow collector somewhere. And as, nTopng actually could act as a NetFlow collector, but it's not something we do in our package. So I'm kind of going to skip over that one. nfSen is a good open source NetFlow collector, and I've got that over here. I'll show you that in a moment. And there are lots of commercial packages that will receive NetFlow information and will graph it or analyze it in various ways. So any graphing or data analysis queries, things like that, all happen on the collector, which is your central server, sort of akin to your network monitoring system in the SNMP case. So as you can see here, I punched in the address of my NetFlow server, which is just another VM on my local network here, and the port that it's listening on, and I've set the max flows to 1 and the lifetime's pretty low here, just to give it a good, so it would get flows moving pretty quickly. Similar to bandwidth D, there has to be a certain level of traffic before it will start pushing flows out. So if you don't see any data, just make sure you're pushing enough traffic through that interface. As for things like the NetFlow version, that's really between you and the collector and what it supports. The higher the better, though. Whatever you can get support for. I think it supports 9, 5, and 1, but 9 is probably the most useful if your collector supports it. Now, if we come over here and look at nfSen, you can see it's this is just running on. I've got a port forward into that local server. It gives you flow information over time. This is like a daily graph, weekly graph, monthly graph, and a yearly graph. So it has your flows here in the first column. It's got packets in the second column and bits in the third. So you can get per packet per second rates here, and you also get bits per second over here. So most people are concerned with the bits per second views. Over here on graphs, it gives you a little bit more detailed view of the, you got flows, packets, and traffic again. And you can kind of see what we're doing here. If you click on one of these graphs, it takes you over to the details view. It takes a little bit to load because it's got a lot of data to chew through. And here it gives you a protocol breakdown and what's going on right at the moment that's chosen on the graph. And like this one here, you can pick a time window, slide this guy over, and it will show you, like I'm just going to go from there to there. During that time window, maybe we'll narrow this focus a little bit more. And you can see here in that time window, it's showing you how many flows, packets, and traffic were through there. Now, if you want to get more information out of it yet, I picked my time window, and then you can go down here and you can either list the flows or do your top end stats. I'm just going to do like the top 10 hosts by IP address. Let's order by bytes and process. And then down here at the bottom, it has dumped out, who the top talkers were, and then what percentage of data a given user was responsible for in that particular time period. So. And then if you hover over this here, it gives you a view just as a whois lookup on that IP block. So, and the amount of data that you can pull back out of this really depends on your NetFlow collector and what your skills are. This just giving you a little brief intro here with nfSen, but there are lots of other options out there. So it's really whatever you like to use for that. So. But well, there you have it. That's really most of all the other options we've got for traffic monitoring. I don't know if you have any questions. We can move on to questions. And you can have multiple packages of these installed at the same time, but I would not recommend installing all of them like I have done here for this demonstration. Just not a very good idea. But if you have any questions, go ahead and just type them in the chat. That is the right chat window. I discussed that pretty early on, but I'll show you again very briefly. It's just your traffic graph widget here. As long as your browser's open, it will be graphing data here, and you can control which graphs are expanded, and if you want to save which ones are expanded, you just hit the wrench and then press save. So there's not much to do there. If it's not present in your list, just click the plus and then find it, traffic graphs here, click it, and it'll pop up, and then you can drag it wherever you want to have it in your column list. Okay, nTopng, they completely redesigned it. I mean, the GUI is a lot better looking. nTopng does not work on NanoBSD. It's a full install only, strictly full installs. In terms of the amount of data it shows you, I think it does show you a little bit more information than the old nTop. It's organized and structured a bit differently, but it definitely works a lot better. We had users that complained all the time that the old nTop package would just die, or it would stop working, or they couldn't get it running, and we've had very few problems especially on 2.2 with nTopng. For as far as CPU usage, I'm not sure we have any real good actual data to support that. Who's bigger or better or uses more? We have had people complain that bandwidth D uses quite a bit of CPU over time, but others, not so much. It's going to boil down to basically the more traffic you have, the more CPU any of these are going to do, especially the ones that do per IP data. But nTopng does chew up quite a bit of CPU on its own, just by nature of what it does and how much data it collects. Let's see, would bandwidth D, ftop, and nTopng be overkill for one install? Not necessarily. The only thing you probably can get out of bandwidth D versus nTopng is a pretty per host graph, unless there might be a way to get that out of nTopng, but I didn't see one in my poking around. But honestly, you probably don't need bandwidth D if you've got nTopng on there. But now, IfTop is fine to have in combination with anything else. It's small, it's console only, it's not going to hurt anything else to have that installed. So no question there, that's good to have in combination with anything else. But personally, if you can get away with nTopng, I'd do that and just ignore bandwidth D if you can. Let's see, any of the packages allow policy, for example, switching to a different WAN interface above a certain data quota? No, we don't have, nothing hooks in like that. We don't have anything that would do any kind of a bandwidth quota that would hook in with multi-WAN or anything like that. None of these would actually be able to take any action based off of that, at least not in the way we've got them here. You might be able to script something, but it's nothing we have built in or anything that we have a means to control at this time. I just realized I was looking at that traffic graph back there. I've left my my VM downloading a giant ISO image, so let me cancel that. As soon as I cancel it, let's watch that bandwidth graph drop dramatically. There we go. Triggering or notifying of a live animal. I don't. It might be possible in nTopng, but I haven't really gotten that deep into it. None of the others that are built in do. If you are exporting NetFlow data to a NetFlow collector, you can see lots of those do have things like a concept of alerts. So you can set up alerts and conditions, and it can send email and call plugins and things like that. But this is an external system. It's not built into the not built in. That's something you can have external. Uh, it's nice to. It would be a nice feature, but it's kind of dependent on the packages themselves having that feature. I imagine there are some things like with SNMP, if you've got something like Cacti, there are plugins for Cacti and presumably other network management systems in similar areas where if your bandwidth on an interface goes above a certain level, it could flag you in some way. But those are all external notifications again. Anything else? Lantern certified unit question. What about it? Or which particular unit are you talking about? The lantern units we did used to sell, like the 7535, 7541, 7551, those we're not carrying those anymore, and we're dropping those and moving to our ADI hardware. But there are still a lot of them out there, and they work very well. So what is it you wanted to know about the 7541? With a full install, probably. Those had a decent amount of RAM. I personally haven't run it on one of those, but I've seen people who have. This particular virtual machine that I set all these up on, as you can see, it's only got a gig of RAM, and it's only using about 20% of it. So I mean, it's pretty heavy, but obviously with more users is going to take up a little bit more. But it's not. I mean, it's heavy, but it's not that heavy. The new meeting software, we will definitely be advising, putting on an advance notice about that. If there's any specific instructions or anything, a link, whatever to follow, that will all show up in the portal, like we do with the link for this. We'll have that up in the portal, so just keep an eye there. What we may end up using is the same software we use for our university classes, which, since it does screencasting pretty well, we're just not sure it's a good fit for this, but it's something we're definitely going to be testing out. So it should be able to, any kind of access info or URLs, anything you need, it'll show up in the portal. Yeah, we've had some issues with Fuse over the years, but over the last year, it's been okay. But we've had some. It's just been really quirky, and then them dropping support for screen sharing from Linux is the last straw. It's just everybody's had audio issues, and now they're trying to push everybody toward their web client, and it doesn't necessarily work very well. And it wants pure Chrome, not even Chromium, and it's just we'll be happy to move away from it. All right. Anything else, or are we ready to wrap up? I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. We'll see you back here next month. We haven't decided on a topic yet for next month. But when we do, we'll post about it. Probably send out a gold newsletter like we have been doing the last couple of months, and we'll have it on the blog and post it in the forum, that kind of stuff. Again, the access info, all that stuff, we'll get that out to you. So one last question there. The 7541 and 7551, those have all been discontinued. We're not picking up any more Lanert gear. It's from here out. We're going to be focusing on the ADI hardware. The new hardware, it's just if you go to store.pfSense.org, it's up now. It's like the SG line. I went over it in the Hangout last month, but there's two options we're going to have right now. There's a 4-port and a 6-port, and then there's going to be a smaller option and a bigger option available, hoping about June or so. But the 4-port model that we will have available right away, it's roughly equivalent to the 7541, if not a little bit better. Traffic shaping, Ted asked about traffic shaping. That is a very popular request. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to that next month, but it is one we do plan to cover, but it will probably actually end up split out into several hangouts because it's such a big topic. We need to, and we can't, there's no way we could cover everything in one hangout. So we need to figure out a good way to break that down and spread it out. So, okay, well, I guess we'll see everybody next month, and just keep an eye on the portal and keep an eye on the blog, and we'll get the information out for that. If you have any questions, if you got support with us, send them off to us on support. If you're otherwise, post them on the forum. We'll try and get to some stuff. Most of these are all pretty straightforward. Should have relatively few problems with any of these. Possible exception being bandwidth D, because people have had some issues with that. But other than that, it's just happy graphing. See you next month. Bye.